The tent smelled like champagne and entitlement. I stood at the edge of the garden party, if you could call my sister's grotesque display a garden party, watching the obscenely wealthy mingling beneath Edison bulbs that cost more than my monthly rent. White roses cascaded from every surface like a tide of privilege. Catering staff moved with practiced invisibility, and somewhere a string quartet played something I was certain had a name I couldn't afford to pronounce. My daughter Clara held my hand so tightly her small fingers had gone white. "Mommy, is that ice cream?" She pointed to an elaborate dessert table where a man in a chef's whites was sculpting something from liquid nitrogen. "Yes, baby," I whispered, squeezing back. "But we're just here to—" "Willow! Willow!" The voice cut through the air like a blade. My sister Beatrice materialized beside us in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 and barely concealed disdain. She wore a white linen suit that probably cost more than my car. Not that I had a car that wasn't held together by prayers and duct tape. Her blonde hair was styled into something that required professional intervention at least twice a week. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist threw fractured rainbows across her perfect skin. I felt Clara shrink against my leg. "Hi, Beatrice." I managed smoothing the front of my dress, the same dress I'd worn to waitress at the Riverside in all week. It hung on me like a flag, and there was a small stain near the hem that no amount of scrubbing had removed. "Thank you for inviting us. Leo's in the bouncy house," and Clara was just about to— Beatrice's grip on my arm was sudden and cruel. She pulled me away from my daughter, her smile never wavering, her voice dropping to a hiss that only I could hear. "I told you this was a themed event," she said, her eyes traveling down my body like I was something she'd found in the garbage. "Garden elegance. The children look messy. Leo's shirt is wrinkled, and Clara's shoes are— honestly, Willow, they're tragic. They're going to ruin the visual flow of the photographs." The words landed like stones in my chest. I'd bought those shoes at a discount outlet. They were pink with little bows. Clara loved them. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." "Of course you didn't," Beatrice continued, cutting me off with the ease of long practice. "That's always been your problem. No attention to detail. No appreciation for what matters." She released my arm, smoothing her own sleeve as if my proximity had contaminated her. "Speaking of which, we're finally closing on the manor. The Vance Manor closes next Friday. You need to sign the release papers tomorrow. The lawyer's expecting you at 2:00. I felt the world tilt slightly. The manor, our grandmother's house, the only place on earth where my children had ever truly been happy. "Beatrice, can we talk about this? The children have so many memories there, and I know that grandmother Adeline wanted—" "What Adeline wanted is irrelevant," she snapped. "She's been dead for 3 years. The house is a money pit, and it's costing me a fortune to maintain. Besides, the buyer is offering quite generously, and I've already committed the proceeds toward investments that you clearly wouldn't understand." She turned to leave, then paused, looking back at me with something that wasn't quite pity, more like the expression one might give a piece of trash one had nearly stepped in. "And for God's sake, take these kids home. They aren't important enough for my daughter's aesthetic or the family's solvency." I watched her walk away, her shoulders back, her head high, the picture of satisfied cruelty. Then I heard it. Leo's voice, small and broken, coming from somewhere near the bouncy house. "Am I messy, Mommy?" My 8-year-old son had overheard. Of course he had. The universe had made sure of it. Clara's lower lip began to tremble, and she looked up at me with eyes that held far too much understanding for a 6-year-old. "Mommy, are we bad?" I don't remember the drive home. I remember the way the headlights cut through the darkness, and how Clara fell asleep in her car seat, her small face streaked with tears she'd been trying to hide. I remember Leo sitting rigidly in the back, his arms wrapped around himself asking in a voice that had become very small, "Can we go to Grandma's house? The big one? With the library and the garden?" "Not right now, buddy." I'd managed, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "Not for a while." What I didn't tell him was never. That Beatrice was selling it. That some stranger would own the rooms where our grandmother had told us stories, where Leo had learned to ride his bike on the long driveway, where Clara had picked flowers and pressed them in books because she thought she could keep them forever. By the time I pulled into the cramped parking lot of my apartment building, a 3-story structure that smelled perpetually of other people's cooking and desperation, I had transformed my despair into something else entirely. Something cold. Something focused. I carried Clara inside, her limp body heavy with exhaustion. Leo followed, trailing behind me like a ghost. I tucked them both into the bed they shared in the bedroom they had to share, kissed their foreheads, and closed the door softly behind me. Then I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the debris of my life. Bills I couldn't pay, eviction notices I kept putting in a drawer, a credit card statement that made me feel physically ill. And I made a decision. I was done being pathetic. My name is Willow Vance, and I am 32 years old. This is important, not because of who I am now, but because of who I used to be. I was once a woman with a future. I had a PhD in architectural history with a specialization in early American preservation. I'd published papers. I'd been offered a position at a prestigious museum. My future had been mapped out in gold ink. Then my life crumbled in the space of 18 months. The relationship with my ex-husband had been toxic in ways I didn't fully understand until it was too late. By the time I'd extracted myself from it, with nothing but my 2 children and the clothes we were wearing, I'd lost my career momentum, my financial footing, and my sense of self-worth. I'd taken whatever jobs I could find, cleaning houses which I was hired and fired from because I was overqualified and made the other employees uncomfortable, waitressing where my feet ached and my tips came from people who treated me like furniture, and occasionally, when I was desperate, temp work in offices where I could see people my own age running departments and making decisions that shaped industries. Beatrice had made sure I understood, at every opportunity, that my failures were character flaws, that some people were simply born with less capacity, less intelligence, less worth. Our mother, Eliza, had simply agreed. The cruelest part was that I believed them. My apartment was so small you could stand in the center and touch both walls if you stretched your arms. The kitchen was a narrow strip that barely fit one person. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every argument, every television, every intimate moment of my neighbors' lives. But it was what I could afford on my combined income of approximately $1,600 a month, which meant it was home. The manor, though God, the manor. It had been built in 1743 by my great-great-grandfather as a statement of permanence and prosperity. It sprawled across 30 acres of what had once been prime agricultural land, now surrounded by the encroaching suburbs of Boston. The house itself was a masterpiece of colonial architecture. Hand-hewn beams, original plaster, a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves that Adeline had stocked with first editions. There was a widow's walk on the roof where you could see for miles. A garden where roses had been growing for over 2 centuries. When our grandmother was alive, the manor had been a sanctuary. She'd invited us there every summer, Beatrice, me, and our cousins, and she'd treated us all with the same fierce love. "This house is your birthright," she'd tell me, running her hand along the carved banister in the main staircase. "Not in the way of money or property, Willow, in the way of knowing where you come from, knowing that you're part of something that lasts." 2 weeks before she died, a sudden heart attack, unfair and final, she'd pulled me into the library and made me sit with her in the wingback chairs by the window. "I'm going to tell you something," she'd said, taking my hand. "Something important." Her eyes, the same gray as mine, had been sharp and focused. Look closer, my dear. The history is the value. Remember that. When everything else fails, when you're lost, when you think you have nothing, look closer. The history is the value. I'd thought she was being metaphorical, poetic. I'd held her hand and nodded and cried into her shoulder, and I hadn't understood that she might be telling me something literal. By the time Beatrice inherited the executor position, which she claimed as her right, having married rich and maintained proper social standing, the manor had become an inconvenience to her. A building that needed constant maintenance, grounds that required professional care, a money pit. She'd been rushing the sale for months, claiming the house was structurally unstable, which I knew was a lie because I'd had it inspected during my initial desperation about whether I could somehow afford to buy it myself. The inspector's report had been glowing, remarkably well-maintained despite age. Foundation is sound, excellent bones. Beatrice didn't care about facts. She cared about the money, and she cared about keeping me down. The next morning, I did what I always did. I packed the children's backpacks for school, made them breakfast from eggs, and the cheapest bread I could find braided Clara's hair, trying very hard not to think about how Beatrice had criticized her appearance, and drove them to their overcrowded public school, where the teachers did their best, but were visibly exhausted by systemic failure. Then I went to my cleaning job. Mrs. Henderson's house was in Beacon Hill, one of those pristine townhouses that cost more than I would earn in a lifetime. I'd been cleaning for her for 8 months, showing up at 9 a.m. sharp, working until 2 p.m., and then rushing to my waitressing shift at the Riverside Inn. Mrs. Henderson was at least kind. She didn't bark orders or assume I was stealing. She sometimes left me coffee in a proper mug. Not a disposable cup, but a real mug. And once, when I'd mentioned offhandedly that my daughter loved books, she'd given me a stack of children's literature from her own shelves, books she said her grandchildren had outgrown. "You're so good at what you do," she'd said to me once, watching me restore shine to her hardwood floors. "It seems like you should be doing something else, something that uses your mind." I'd smiled and said nothing, because what was there to say? That I had a PhD? That I'd published papers about architectural preservation in journals that no one outside of academia read? That I'd been told by every person I'd met since my divorce that I was overqualified for everything and underqualified for anything that paid a living wage? That day, I was so distracted by the conversation with Beatrice that I nearly broke one of Mrs. Henderson's china figurines, a Hummel that probably cost more than I made in a week. "Willow, are you all right?" Mrs. Henderson had appeared in the doorway with that expression people wear when they're not sure if you're about to have a nervous breakdown. Fine, I'd lied. Just tired. But I wasn't fine. I was sitting on a powder keg. At 1:47 p.m., I checked my phone. There was an email notification I'd missed while working, from a sender I didn't recognize. Phoenix Foundation Consulting. My hands were shaking as I opened it. "Dear Ms. Vance, I hope this message finds you well. My name is Professor Marcus Hemlock, and we had the pleasure of working together at the university several years ago when you were pursuing your graduate degree in architectural history. Your work on preservation methodologies was exceptional. I am writing with an unusual opportunity. I have recommended you to a consulting firm that specializes in historical property assessment and documentation. They are seeking someone with your specific expertise in early American structural integrity and preservation protocols. The position is remote, which I understand may be advantageous to you given your current circumstances. The salary is $8,500 per month to start, with potential for significant increase based on project completion. They are looking to fill the role immediately. If you are interested, please respond by 5 p.m. today. The interview would occur this evening via secure video call. Best regards, Professor Marcus Hemlock. I read the email 4 times. $8,500 a month. That was more than I'd made in the past 3 months combined. That was more than double what I currently earned. That was a way out. But the wording was strange. I understand your current circumstances. Had Marcus researched me? How much did he know about my fall from grace? And this Phoenix Foundation, I'd never heard of it. The email address was generic. No company website was mentioned. The whole thing had an odd, almost clandestine quality. It could be a scam, but it could also be real. I did the only thing I could do. I responded, Professor Hemlock, thank you for thinking of me. I am very interested in this opportunity. Please let the consulting firm know I'm available for an interview this evening. Willow Vance. I didn't tell anyone. Not Mrs. Henderson. Not my co-workers at the Riverside Inn. Not my mother, with whom I hadn't spoken in weeks, since her last call had been to relay that Beatrice was finally doing something smart by selling the manor. I picked up the children from school and made them dinner, macaroni and cheese from a box, with frozen peas mixed in for vegetables. I helped them with their homework. I read Clara a story about a mouse who found a family. I tucked them both into bed by 8:30 p.m. Then I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, my heart hammering in my chest, and waited for 9 p.m. The video call was scheduled for 9:15 p.m. At 9:14, my computer dinged with an invitation. I clicked it, and the screen resolved into the image of a man I'd never seen before. He was in his mid-60s, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to see everything. His background was blurred into an abstract pattern that I realized was intentional security. He was sitting in shadow, and the camera angle was just slightly off-center, as if to prevent any chance of someone being able to identify the location. Ms. Vance, he said. His voice was measured and precise. Thank you for responding so quickly. My name is Sterling. Marcus Hemlock recommended you very highly. Thank you, I said, trying to sound professional despite my kitchen table and my visible nervousness. I'm very interested in what you're offering. I can see that, Sterling said, and I realized he could probably see my hands shaking. Before we proceed, I need to make something clear. The work we do is sensitive. The clients we serve value discretion above almost everything else. You cannot discuss this opportunity with anyone, not your family, not your friends, not casual acquaintances. Do you understand? I understand, I said. Additionally, I will need to run a full background check before we proceed. This will include financial history, employment history, and criminal background. The vetting process will take approximately 48 hours. If you proceed, you're authorizing this check. My stomach clenched. What if he found out about the eviction notice? What if he discovered my ex-husband's allegations? All unproven, all ultimately dismissed, but still on record. What if he learned that I'd had a credit card maxed out during my divorce? Yes, I said. I authorize it. Sterling nodded. Then let me explain what we do. The Phoenix Foundation is a privately held consulting firm that specializes in historical property assessment. We work with private collectors, museums, and wealthy individuals who own significant historical properties. These properties sometimes contain items of historical importance, documents, artifacts, structural elements that need to be properly cataloged and preserved. He paused, letting that sink in. More specifically, Ms. Vance, we sometimes discover that historical properties contain surprises, things that weren't documented in modern records, things that previous owners might not have been aware of. When we discover these surprises, we need expertise in dating, authentication, and preservation. That's where you come in. I see, I said slowly, though I wasn't sure I did. Our current project involves a property in your region. Sterling continued, a colonial-era home with significant architectural interest. We need a preliminary assessment of its structural integrity, its historical significance, and any undocumented features it might possess. You would spend approximately 2 weeks reviewing records, examining the property physically, and documenting your findings. The compensation for this project would be $12,000. $12,000. That was my rent for 8 months. That was breathing room. That was time. When would the project begin? I asked. Tomorrow, Sterling said. Immediately after you're cleared. And Ms. Vance, one more thing. If you discover something significant during your assessment, something that has substantial historical or financial value, you're to report it directly to me. To no one else. Not to the property's current owner. Not to local authorities. Not to anyone. Do you understand? Yes, I whispered. Then we have an agreement. You'll receive an email tomorrow morning with the first payment and a complete list of the property's public records. You'll begin your research immediately. Marcus recommended you because he said you had both exceptional expertise and exceptional integrity. I'm trusting that his judgment is sound. It is, I said. Thank you. Thank you so much. Sterling's expression didn't change. Don't thank me yet, Ms. Vance. You have no idea what you might be about to uncover. The background check cleared at 7:47 a.m. My phone buzzed with a notification from an account I'd never seen before, Phoenix Foundation Trust, showing a deposit of $12,000. $12,000. More money than I'd ever had in my bank account at one time. I sat on my bed, our bed which I shared with Clara when she had nightmares, and I cried, not from happiness, exactly, but from the sheer relief of knowing that I could pay my overdue rent, that I could buy groceries, that I could breathe. The children were already at school when another email arrived, this one with attachments. Your research materials, it said, complete structural records from 1,743 present, original deed, and all amendments, property surveys, and ownership history, cross-referenced with local registry documents. Begin immediately. Report findings to SM only. I spent the day, my day off from cleaning and waitressing, something I couldn't remember the last time I'd had, going through the documents. The property was listed as the Vance Manor, and the address made my stomach drop. It was the manor. Our manor. Beatrice's manor. The house she was selling. For one moment, I considered contacting Sterling, telling him there must be a mistake, that I couldn't possibly assess a property owned by my own sister. It would be a conflict of interest. It would be unethical. Then I remembered Beatrice's hand on my arm, Clara's trembling lip, Leo's small voice asking if he was messy. I opened the files. The property had been built by my great-great-grandfather, Nathaniel Vance, in 1743, original deed filed with the colonial authorities, granting 50 acres for the purpose of establishing a permanent settlement and residence for Nathaniel Vance and his heirs in perpetuity. There were dozens of subsequent amendments, additions to the structure, property line adjustments, easements granted and revoked. Most were mundane. Property taxes, maintenance improvements, boundary disputes with neighbors. But one document stopped me cold. Buried in 1887, more than a century after the house's construction, was an amendment filed by Nathaniel's great-grandson, Theodore Vance. The amendment described something peculiar, a modification to the library's structural integrity, specifically noting the installation of a load-bearing false wall for purposes of concealing a private study and storage chamber. The amendment had been filed because Theodore was making the structural change official, presumably because of some legal requirement or property evaluation. The reason listed was vague, for purposes of preserving historical documents and items of personal significance. Then it was never mentioned again, not in any subsequent deed, Not in any property survey, not in any will or inheritance document. It was as if everyone had forgotten it existed. The history is the value, Adeline had said. I sat back in my chair, my heart racing. A hidden room. In the manor. A room that no one had documented in over a century. For 2 days, I consumed every piece of information I could find about the manor's architectural history. I studied the original blueprints, examined the property surveys from different eras, cross-referenced architectural styles and construction techniques. I reached out to historical societies and local registries, asking careful questions about the property without revealing my connection to it. And slowly, an image began to form in my mind. The library at the manor, the room where Adeline had held me during so many afternoons, had a particular architectural quirk. The bookcases on the north wall went all the way to the ceiling. The wall behind them was solid, but if you measured the room's exterior dimensions against its interior layout, there was almost exactly 6 feet of unaccounted for space. A hidden room, probably small, probably sealed since 1887, maybe longer. I opened a new email to Sterling. Initial assessment complete. Preliminary findings indicate the property contains a previously undocumented structural chamber, likely dating to 1887 or earlier. The chamber appears to be sealed and has been forgotten by subsequent owners. Will require physical inspection of the property to confirm. Awaiting further instructions. The response came within minutes. Excellent work. The assessment confirms our initial research. You will visit the property tomorrow. Arrive at 9 a.m. Do not inform anyone of your presence. Do not contact the property's current owner. Conduct a thorough exterior inspection of the library wall. Document everything photographically. Report back by evening. This is critical. Do not deviate from these instructions. Beatrice had changed the security code on the manor's gate. I stood at the wrought iron entrance the next morning in my professional clothes. A blazer I bought at a thrift store, dark jeans, sensible shoes. And I realized I couldn't get in. But I was prepared for this. I'd reviewed the property records. There was a secondary entrance, a service gate used by deliveries and maintenance about a quarter mile around the property's perimeter. The lock on that gate, according to records from 1964, was keyed the same way as all the old locks on the manor itself. I'd obtained a copy of that key. Sterling had sent it to me. No explanation, just the key in a small envelope marked service entrance. The service gate opened with a soft click. I walked through, my hands shaking, feeling like a thief on my own family's land. The grounds were overgrown. Beatrice had apparently stopped paying for the groundskeeper's services. The rose garden, which Adeline had tended so carefully, had begun to surrender to wild growth. Weeds pushed up through the gravel paths. It broke my heart. The back entrance to the manor opened just as easily. The key turned in the lock like I'd done it yesterday, not years ago. The door swung open to reveal the mudroom. And beyond it, the kitchen, and beyond that, the hallway that led to the library. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floors. Dust motes danced in the light, streaming through the windows. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, frozen in time. The library, it was exactly as I remembered it. The floor-to-ceiling bookcases, the wingback chairs where Adeline and I had sat, the window seat where Leo had fallen asleep reading picture books, the smell of old paper and possibility. I moved to the north wall, the wall with the bookcases that reached all the way to the ceiling. I began to measure, running my hands along the wooden shelves, looking for inconsistencies in the wood grain, for seams or joints that didn't quite match. And there, just at eye level, on the shelves that would have held my grandfather's collection of first editions, I found it, a seam, barely visible, hidden by the grain of the wood. a perfectly rectangular outline that indicated a hidden door, disguised as part of the bookshelf itself. I photographed everything: the seam, the measurements, the bookcases from different angles. I examined the rest of the wall, looking for any mechanism that might open the hidden door, but there was nothing visible. No button, no lever, no obvious release. Whatever was behind that wall had been sealed and forgotten. I sent the photographs and measurements to Sterling. Then I stood in the library for a long moment, breathing in the smell of history and family and time, thinking about my grandmother. The history is the value, she'd said. I was beginning to understand. Sterling's instruction came that evening. Exceptional work. Your preliminary assessment is confirmed. The hidden chamber exists and contains items of significant historical importance. Before we proceed with documenting the chamber, I must inform you of something critical. The property you have assessed is not merely a historical curiosity. It contains items that may be worth between $4 and $8 million, depending on condition and provenance. The current owner is unaware of this value. The current owner, in fact, is preparing to sell the property for approximately $2.3 million, a fraction of its true worth. This is where your integrity comes into question. Ms. Vance, I have deliberately positioned you to discover this value. But what you do with this knowledge, that is your choice. You have 48 hours to decide. Will you help us preserve and properly value these historical items? Or will you allow them to be destroyed or lost to private collectors? The decision is yours. I read the email at least 10 times, my mind reeling. $4 to $8 million, hidden in the manor, in a room that Beatrice didn't even know existed. The same Beatrice who was selling the property for $2.3 million. The same Beatrice who had called my children messy. The same Beatrice who had humiliated them at a garden party because their clothes weren't expensive enough. For one moment, I felt something dark unfold inside me. Something that wanted revenge. That wanted to see her face when she realized what she was giving away. But then I thought of something else. I called Sterling. Before I agree to anything, I said, my voice steady. I need to know what's in the chamber. What items are worth that much money? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Sterling said, items that belong in a museum, Ms. Vance. Items that are part of your family's history. Items that your great-great-grandfather's ancestor, a colonial-era cartographer named Edmund Vance, collected and preserved. Maps, documents, original surveys of colonial territories, mathematical instruments, things that shaped the founding of this nation. And you want me to help document them? I want you to help preserve them, Sterling said, properly, ethically, in a way that honors their historical significance, instead of allowing them to be lost or scattered to the highest bidder. I thought about Adeline, about her words, about the way she'd held my hand when she was dying. I'll do it, I said, but under one condition. Name it, Sterling said. My children, I said. If this works, if we preserve these items, they need to know they're part of this legacy. They need to know that they're descendants of someone who mattered, someone who did things that changed history. Because right now, they think they're worthless. They think they're messy and unimportant, and I need them to know the truth. Sterling was quiet for a very long moment. That's not a condition I can accept, he said finally. Not yet. But if you complete this work with integrity, if you help us do this the right way, then perhaps we can find a way to make that happen. Do we have an agreement? Yes, I said. We have an agreement. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of activity and deception. I told Beatrice I needed to reschedule the appointment to sign the release papers. She was annoyed but agreed to meet with me and our mother on Thursday instead of Wednesday. Thursday gave me 3 days. I contacted the locks company listed in the manor's maintenance records and had them open the hidden chamber. The mechanism, when finally exposed, was surprisingly simple, a pin release hidden in the wooden frame designed to be invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. The door swung open, and I stepped into a room that time had forgotten. It was small, barely 10 feet by 12 feet, with a low ceiling that made me duck my head. The walls were lined with shelves, and on every shelf were treasures, maps, hand-drawn on parchment, with handwritten notes in the margins, documents sealed in leather cases, mathematical instruments, compasses and surveying tools made of brass and wood, leather-bound journals filled with sketches and calculations, and notes in a hand I recognized as similar to the signature on the original deed. Edmund Vance's collection. I photographed everything, documented every item, made detailed notes. It took hours. My hands shook as I handled items that were literally centuries old. These weren't just artifacts. They were the recorded thoughts and work of a man who had helped map the American colonies. A man who had understood that knowledge and documentation were power. A man who was my ancestor. Sterling sent a team, 3 specialists in historical preservation, a photographer, and a lawyer. They arrived discreetly, with careful instructions to leave no trace of their presence. They documented every single item, assessing condition, establishing provenance, creating a complete inventory. "This is extraordinary," whispered Dr. Elizabeth Chin, the head of the assessment team, holding a map that showed the original survey of the Massachusetts territories in 1756. "Do you understand what this is? This shows Edmund Vance's own calculations for territorial boundaries. Some of these notations don't match official records. He was making his own assessments of colonial borders. This is primary source material that could reshape our understanding of colonial surveying practices." By Wednesday evening, everything had been documented, photographed, and carefully restored to the hidden chamber. I had helped Sterling prepare the necessary legal documentation, specifically a certificate of historical significance and curatorship that, if signed by a recognized architectural expert with proper credentials, could immediately trigger a state-level historical preservation hold on the property. I was that expert. All I had to do was sign it. Sterling had made the terms very clear. If you sign this document before the property sale completes, it will trigger a temporary freeze on the transaction. A property designated as historically significant cannot be sold without proper approval from the State Historical Commission. That process takes months. During that time, the property will be assessed, the hidden chamber will be officially documented, and your sister's sale will be canceled. And then what happens? I'd asked. Then, Sterling said, the property's true value will be established, and because you will have been the one to discover and document it, and because your family connection makes you the most appropriate custodian, you will become the director of the Vance Historical Preserve. Your sister will receive nothing. Your mother will receive nothing. The property will be preserved, the artifacts will be properly cared for, and your family's legacy will be honored. I'd stared at him through the screen. You're essentially taking revenge on my family. No, Sterling said quietly. I'm ensuring that history is preserved and that the people who tried to destroy it for profit face consequences for that choice. Those are 2 different things. Thursday morning, I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment and I didn't recognize myself. It wasn't just the clothes. I'd used part of my first payment to buy a proper suit, dark gray wool, perfectly tailored, with a white silk blouse. My hair was styled. My makeup was careful and professional. I looked like someone who mattered. I looked like someone who had always mattered. The lawyer's office was in a tall building downtown, with all glass and steel and intimidating modern architecture. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor, my heart hammering in my chest, and I walked into the conference room where my entire life had come down to this moment. Beatrice was already there, looking serene and confident. She wore a power suit in cream, her jewelry understated but expensive. Our mother, Eliza, a woman who had never quite forgiven me for being born second, for not being as beautiful as Beatrice, for not understanding the rules of social hierarchy, sat beside her, filing her nails with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd learned that cruelty was acceptable if you had enough money. The lawyer, an older man named Patterson who'd handled the Vance family's legal affairs for decades, looked up from his desk and smiled. "Willow, wonderful to see you. Shall we begin?" "Of course," I said, sitting down across from my sister. Beatrice slid a stack of documents across the table. "This is the release of interest," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Standard liability waiver. You sign, you acknowledge that you're relinquishing any and all claims to the manor, and you receive your distribution $10,000, as discussed. The sale closes tomorrow, and we move on with our lives." "Actually," I said, opening my briefcase, "I have a few documents of my own." The lawyer looked curious. Beatrice's expression didn't change, but I saw her fingers grip the armrest just a little tighter. "Before I sign anything," I continued, "I need to address something important. During my review of the manor's historical records, which is part of my ongoing work as an architectural historian, I discovered documentation of a previously unreported structural feature." Eliza waved her hand dismissively. "Willow, we don't have time for this. The sale is finalized. Just sign." I pulled out the certificate of historical significance and curatorship. I placed it carefully on the table in front of Patterson. "I've prepared this documentation, which I'm required to file as the certified architectural expert who has assessed the property. It establishes that the Vance Manor contains features of significant historical importance and qualifies for state-level preservation protection." "What?" Beatrice's voice had become sharp. "What are you talking about?" "The manor is architecturally significant," I said calmly, "which means it cannot be sold without approval from the State Historical Commission. That approval process takes several months." "That's ridiculous," Beatrice snapped. "The house is just old. That doesn't make it." "Actually, it does," Patterson interjected, looking at the documents I provided. His face had gone pale. "If this assessment is correct, and if the state agrees with the historical significance designation, the transaction would be automatically frozen pending historical commission review." "This is insane." Eliza stood up. "She's sabotaging us. This is clearly some kind of revenge. We'll sue her." I looked at them both with a calm I didn't entirely feel. "You can sue if you like, but the certification I'm filing is based on legitimate historical findings. The property genuinely does contain features worthy of preservation, and I'm going to file this today." Beatrice leaned forward, and for the first time, I saw actual fear in her eyes. "If you file that, you're destroying the sale. You're destroying our investments. You understand what you're doing? We've already committed those funds to purchases." "Yes," I said quietly. "I understand exactly what I'm doing." "Then you're a sabotaging, bitter, failed—" Beatrice started, but I held up my hand. "I'm done letting you define me," I said. It was the calmest my voice had ever sounded. "I'm done accepting that my children are messy or unimportant. I'm done accepting that my intelligence, my education, my expertise don't matter because I made the mistake of marrying the wrong person." I looked directly at Eliza. "And I'm done accepting your judgment as anything other than the bitter projection of a woman who's spent her entire life measuring people's worth by their bank accounts." The silence that followed was profound. "What do you want?" Beatrice finally asked, and the venom in her voice had been replaced by something much more dangerous: desperation. "I want you to understand that you can't destroy people without consequences," I said, And I want my children to know that they're valuable, that they're important, that they're descended from people who mattered. Patterson was reviewing the documents more carefully now. His expression had shifted from concerned to shocked. These findings. He began slowly. If they're accurate, the historical value of this property, this could change everything. Exactly, I said. Beatrice stood up abruptly, her chair scraping backward. This isn't over, Willow. We'll fight this. We'll prove your findings are fabricated. You'll regret this. You and those pathetic children of yours will. Will what? I asked. Will become less valuable because we already know that's your metric and it never bothered you before. The difference now is that I don't care what you think. I left the lawyer's office at 11:47 a.m. without signing anything. By 2 p.m., I had filed the certificate of historical significance with the State Historical Commission. By 3 p.m., the title company had received the official notification and placed a hold on the sale. By 4 p.m., Beatrice's phone was probably ringing off the hook as the buyer's lawyers called to inform her that the transaction could not proceed. I drove to pick up my children from school, and when they climbed into the car, I told them something I should have told them a long time ago. You know how I'm always talking about buildings? I asked about how they tell stories. Clara nodded, unbuckling her seatbelt so she could lean between the front seats. Like the library at the big house. Exactly like that, I said. Well, that library has a very special secret. And that secret was hidden there by our great-great-great-grandfather, who was a very important man. He was a cartographer, someone who made maps. And he collected beautiful, important things because he understood that knowledge and history are more valuable than money. Is that why people study things? Leo asked, his serious eyes meeting mine in the mirror. Yes, I said, and I realized I was crying. That's exactly why, buddy. Because we want to understand where we come from. Because we want to know that we're part of something bigger. Because our ancestors did things that mattered, and we're connected to that. Will we go to the big house again? Clara asked. Yes, I promised. Soon. And you're going to help me take care of it. Because you're Vancess. And Vancess protect what matters. Everything that happened next unfolded with the precision of a carefully choreographed dance. Sterling, whose full name, I would later learn, was Simon Mercer Sterling, was not actually a consultant. He was the executive director of the Preservation Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to rescuing historically significant properties from exploitation. He'd been monitoring the sale of the manor for months, waiting for the right moment, watching to see who in the family still had enough integrity to help. When Professor Hemlock recommended me, Sterling had made his decision. I needed to know, he told me during our final video call, that you would choose preservation over revenge, that you would be motivated by history, not by spite. And you proved me right. When I offered you the chance to crush your sister, you chose instead to save the house. I did choose revenge. I said, just a different kind. The kind that doesn't actually harm anyone. It just exposes their choices. Sterling smiled. Exactly. Which is why I'm making you an offer that goes beyond what I've already told you. What followed was a complete restructuring of my life. The State Historical Commission, with Sterling's documentation and support, officially designated the Vance Manor as a property of regional historical significance. This prevented the sale and triggered a comprehensive assessment of the property and its contents. When the hidden chamber was officially discovered and documented, it created a media sensation. Colonial-era cartographers' collection, discovered in Boston area mansion, read one headline, Architectural Historian Uncovers Lost Colonial Records, read another. My name was in all of them. Suddenly, I was not the failed academic. I was not the single mother struggling to survive. I was the expert who had discovered something extraordinary. Universities called. Museums called. Historical societies called. I was offered positions, consulting contracts, speaking engagements. The University of Massachusetts offered me a tenured position as director of the Historical Preservation Department with a salary of $95,000 per year and benefits that included health care and retirement. But the most important offer came from Sterling. The Preservation Institute is prepared to establish the Vance Historical Preserve. He told me, the manor will be professionally maintained. The collection will be properly archived and displayed. And we would like to offer you the position of executive director, overseeing all operations and ensuring that Edmund Vance's legacy is honored and shared with the public. The salary is $120,000 per year, with a staff of 5 and a substantial annual budget for preservation and education. I said yes before he could finish the sentence. The transformation was complete. 6 months later, Beatrice and Eliza had to face the full consequences of their choices. When the historical value of the manor was officially established, appraised at $7.2 million due to the priceless collection it contained, they realized they'd been trying to sell a property worth a fraction of its actual value. The buyer, faced with the newfound restrictions and the added complexity of owning a historically significant property with public access requirements, sued them for fraud and misrepresentation. Beatrice's husband, it turned out, was not as supportive of her as she'd believed. When his legal team determined that her actions could expose him to significant liability, he distanced himself from her. The divorce was not kind. Eliza, having invested the money she'd expected to receive from the manor sale into a real estate scheme that turned out to be a Ponzi scheme, faced both financial ruin and a federal investigation. She was not charged. She was deemed a victim rather than a perpetrator. But her assets were frozen, her lifestyle evaporated, and she had to move into a small apartment in a modest neighborhood. I didn't take pleasure in their suffering, but I also didn't mourn it. What I did take pleasure in was something else entirely. On a Saturday in September, exactly 1 year after the garden party where my children had been called messy, I stood in the library of the manor with my children and opened the hidden door. We walked into the chamber together. Clara held my hand. Leo stood very still, looking at the artifacts with an expression of pure wonder. This, I said, running my fingers along one of Edmund Vance's maps, was made by our great-great-great-grandfather. He was mapping the world when a lot of people didn't think the world was worth mapping. He was documenting things that other people thought didn't matter. Like us. Clara asked, "Exactly like you." I said, "You both matter. You're valuable. You're important. And you're part of a family that does things that change the world." Leo looked at me. "Mom, am I messy?" My throat tightened. "No, buddy, you're perfect. You were always perfect." She was just broken, and broken people try to hurt other people because it makes them feel less alone. "Is she still broken?" Clara asked. "Probably," I said, "but that's not our problem anymore. We have too many important things to do to worry about her." Over the following months, the manor became a destination. The Vance Historical Preserve opened to the public, welcoming thousands of visitors who came to see Edmund Vance's collection and learn about the role his work played in American history. School groups came. University researchers came. People who understood that history matters came. I gave talks. I published papers. I consulted on other preservation projects. The girl who'd been told she was a failure, that her education didn't matter, that she was overqualified for everything and underqualified for anything worthwhile, became one of the foremost experts on colonial preservation in New England. My children learned that their mother was brilliant, that their ancestors were brilliant, that being intelligent and caring about things that last forever was not a character flaw. It was a legacy. I saw Beatrice exactly once after everything collapsed. It was at the grocery store, 6 months after I'd taken control of the manor. She was buying discount groceries, the kind I used to buy, standing in line with her shoulders hunched and her eyes on the ground. Her hair was graying at the roots. Her clothes looked like they'd come from a thrift store. She looked small. I could have walked past her. I could have pretended I didn't see her. I could have let her remain invisible, the way she tried to make me invisible. Instead, I stopped. "Hello, Beatrice," I said. She looked up, and I watched her face go through a series of expressions: shock, shame, defiance, and finally, something that might have been regret. "I'm not going to apologize," I said. "Not for filing those documents, not for preserving the manor, not for any of it. You did terrible things, Beatrice. Cruel, petty, deliberate things. And you face the consequences. That's not revenge. That's just how the world works." "Willow," she began, but I held up my hand. "But I want you to understand something," I continued. "I won, not because I destroyed you. I won because I became better than you. Because I chose to care about things that matter. Because I chose to be someone my children could be proud of." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. "You can recover from this," I said, and I meant it. Not to your previous status. Not to the life of privilege you thought you deserved. But you can rebuild. You can become someone different. Someone kinder. Someone whose children aren't ashamed of her. "I don't have children," Beatrice said quietly. "No," I agreed. "But you could still be someone worth knowing. If you wanted to." I paid for my groceries and left her standing there. I never saw her again. 5 years later, on a beautiful spring morning, I stood in the newly renovated East Wing of the Vance Manor, the wing we'd transformed into an educational center, and I watched children pour through the doors. They were from the same overcrowded school where my children had learned to be ashamed of their secondhand clothes. We'd started a program: free admission, school bus transportation, curriculum-aligned guided tours. We were teaching them that history matters, that they matter. Clara, now 11, was giving a tour to one of the school groups. She explained, with the confidence of someone who knew her family's story, exactly how Edmund Vance had surveyed the colonial territories. She talked about maps like they were treasures, because they were. Leo, 13 and brilliant and sensitive as ever, was working with our collection specialist to carefully document new acquisitions. He was considering a future in conservation. He'd decided that protecting beautiful, important things was what he wanted to do with his life. My mother, Eliza, had died 2 years ago. Heart disease, the doctor said, though I'd always thought it was bitterness that finally ate her alive. She died alone, without reconciliation with either of her daughters. It was sad, but it was also a consequence of her choices. Beatrice, I'd heard through mutual acquaintances, was working as a secretary at a small law firm in Providence. She lived quietly, alone, and had become, by all accounts, a kind person. Grief had humbled her. Finally, it had taken losing everything, but she'd eventually become someone better than she'd been before. I found I could wish her well. Sterling and I had become something between friends and colleagues. He oversaw the Preservation Institute's portfolio of properties, and the manor remained his crown jewel. We had coffee regularly and discussed the philosophical nature of preservation, what we save, why we save it, what it means to honor history. "You know what I've learned?" he said to me once. "The best revenge isn't destroying people. It's becoming so undeniably excellent that your former oppressors become irrelevant. They simply don't matter anymore." "Is that what you were doing?" I asked, setting me up to become excellent, so I'd stop caring about revenge. Sterling smiled. "I was giving you the tools. You did the rest." On that spring morning, with the sounds of children laughing and learning filling the manor, I stood in the doorway between the hidden chamber and the library thinking about my grandmother. The history is the value, she'd said. She was right. The history was the value, not the money, though the manor's financial security was important. But the knowledge that we were part of something, that our ancestors had done things that mattered, that intelligence and curiosity and care for the world were things to be proud of. My children had learned that. They carried that forward. And in a very real way, so would every child who walked through these doors and learned that their history mattered, that they mattered, that building something that lasts forever is infinitely more valuable than accumulating things that will eventually crumble to dust. I spent years believing that my worth was determined by my family's judgment. I let their seating charts, their dismissive comments, their casual cruelty convince me that I was less than. But the day I realized my value wasn't their permission to grant, it was my history to reclaim, everything changed. Respect is non-negotiable, and it starts with respecting yourself enough to refuse invisibility, no matter how comfortable that silence has become. The manor taught me that patience is architecture. You build foundations in silence. You document evidence while they're celebrating. You become undeniably excellent while they're still convinced you're powerless. My children learned that survival isn't weakness. It's the first act of rebellion. And transformation isn't revenge. It's the only victory that truly lasts. If you've been gaslit into believing you don't matter, this story is for you. Share it with someone who's been made to feel messy, inadequate, unworthy. Tell them, your silence doesn't make you weak. Your boundaries don't make you difficult. Your survival makes you extraordinary. Because the revolution happens when you decide to reclaim your own ending. Your worth was never in question. It was only ever waiting to be remembered. Subscribe for more stories about setting boundaries and turning humiliation into triumph.